the book and points us in the direction of the answer to the question, who is Christ? And it sets us up for the ability to lay hold of the truths that we will find discussed in the rest of the book. But I decided that we would take our time going through the prologue because some of the things that we see there are crucial to our understanding. Without laying hold of some of these things, you just will be puzzled through many sections of this book about the life of Jesus Christ. I want to remind you that these studies are being recording screenshots. So anything I write on here is recorded. You can watch that while listening to me. As I said, the first week I announced the recordings, you don't have to look at my face again. It's just the screen, all right? But if you're new to this and you would like to get caught up, you can, there are 3 of them already posted. Just go to our church's website, and then you can navigate there to the Wednesday night Bible study, and you'll find a link there that'll take you to where all of these videos are housed, all right? Just to bullet point a few of the things we've learned thus far. The Gospel of John does not begin where some of the other accounts of the life of Jesus begin. You'll remember that there are 4 books in the Bible that we call Gospels. They're descriptions of the life and ministry of Jesus. They are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They're complementary. You can weave them together into a single story. All of them have some different information. The Gospel of John was the one written last, so 4th. And John had a lot of time to think about some of the scriptural or biblical implications of his time spent with Jesus. And so we have this remarkable account of the life of Jesus Christ. And he begins here in the prologue, not with a baby being born and laid in a manger the way some of the other gospel accounts do, but he encourages us to look at the absolute beginning of all things, not just the beginning of the birth of Jesus, the life of Jesus, but the absolute beginning of all things. And to understand that it was Christ who created all things. He makes a connection between the first verse of John 1 and the first verse of the Bible. They both begin with the words, in the beginning. In the first book of the Bible, it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In John 1:1, it tells us, in the beginning was the Word, and we learn a little bit later on that that word is a title he's using for Christ. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And we discussed the fact that the only way you can make sense of those statements is to understand a very foundational truth about God that is, it is the core of the Christian faith. Namely, that God exists eternally as a spirit who is one and yet 3. So we speak of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And we talked about all of that and how that is not a contradiction, that is not a logical fallacy. It's just something that we cannot wrap our minds around because of the unique nature of God. You've never seen anyone like God. You've never seen anything to which you can compare God. But for our purposes, Christ, we learned, is the second person of that triune God. We call him the Son of God, not because in eternity he was born, but because of the relationships between the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So he's God, he created. We have talked about the fact that when he came into the world, he brought light, which is a metaphor for truth. Christ brought truth into a dark world. We looked at some passages of Scripture that teach the reason that this is a dark world. It has to do with humanity's rebellion against God. We discussed the fact that he is the source of life, not just physical life in creation, but spiritual life, because the Bible teaches that every one of us comes into this world spiritually dead. That means spiritually separated from God. Just as physical death is a separation of body and spirit, spiritual death is a separation from the God who gives life. And every person comes into this world separated from him because we're determined to live our own way. Some do a better job at living than others. You might be a good neighbor. I have had, through the years, I've had a lot of neighbors, some good, some bad, and some of the best neighbors I've had aren't even Christians. But they do a good job of living as a neighbor. And yet, that doesn't deny the fact that every one of us come into this world as rebels against God. We'll do it our way. In fact, I'll soothe my conscience by saying, I believe in God. And yet, we determine to think of him our own way, come to him our own way. And that is a continuing part of our rebellion. So anyway, we looked at a number of passages of Scripture that describe these things. And last week we wrapped up with the paragraph that I have right here on the screen. And we're going to pick up where we left off last week. We spoke briefly about the true light. We saw that Jesus Christ is the true light. Remember, I said that there was a theologian and philosopher who used to talk about what he called true truth. We've got all kinds of nonsensical conversations going on that talk about, well, you have your truth and I have my truth, as if that even makes sense. Now, we're talking about truth that is absolute. It applies to everyone, everywhere, in all circles. All right, I'll tell you what let's do. Now I wouldn't single anybody out, but while Doug turns off his phone, let's just do this. Everybody else here, mute or turn off your phones, okay? So if you got your phone with you, please do that. All right. I was, well, anyway, I won't tell you. I was tempted to tell a story I'll save it for another time. It was a story about the time that my wife didn't turn off her phone. But like I said, I'll tell the story another time. So nonsense. True truth is what we want. We want truth that is absolute. It's always true. It applies to every person in every circumstance. John says that Christ is the true light. The true light. And notice that he says that this true light gives light to everyone. It's accessible. Doesn't mean that everybody receives it or embraces it, but it is accessible. He goes on to say that this light, Jesus, was coming into the world, and he was in the world, and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. We spent some time last week about the fact that the world doesn't know the one who created us. Deep within, everyone knows certain things about the Creator. And it doesn't matter if they deny it. Deep within, everyone knows he is there. And that even speaks to the conscience of human beings who've been created in his image. But why don't they know him? Well, we spent some time in a passage. I'm not going to take you there again, but let me just tell you, you can remember last time we talked about putting in this abbreviation CF. It means confer, which means go look here. Confer with Romans 1. And I would start along about verse 18 and read down through, I would say, about verse 25. So on your own, you can look that up. If you don't know how to look that up, you take one of these Bibles that's on the table, and there's an index in the front that tells you where all of the books of the Bible are located. Find Romans. Go to the first chapter, the 18th verse, and start reading. And it tells you about the human condition. Human condition that places us under the wrath of God. Even though we know truth about God, he says it's revealed in the creation. Can't know everything about God, but we can know enough about God that we ought to seek him. And that passage also says that in knowing enough about him, it leaves everyone without excuse. Okay? So Romans 1:18. So the world did not know him. Now, this is talking about all the nations, all the peoples of the earth rejected him, refused him. But then he zeroes in right here on verse 11. He came to his own. His own refers to his own people, his own nation. Let me pull something else up here and remind you of this. In our intro, we talked about the storyline of the Bible. This looks real busy, but it's actually quite simple if you look at the arrow that moves from creation to a future time that I've called recreation. And at the time of the fall, which was humanity's rebellion against God, God made a promise that one would come to set things right. Okay? So from this point forward, point of the fall and the promise, moving forward, the people of God, Israel, descendants of Abraham, looked for the fulfillment of that promise. And as more and more information came through the Bible, they learned that when he comes, he would be the perfect prophet who speaks for God, the perfect priest who brings people to God, and the perfect king who rules for God. Now, you've heard that before. I've gone over this previously. But this was the expectation. They were looking for this one who would come. The Gospel of John tells us about his coming. And you will remember we pointed out that the Gospel of John falls right here on this timeline. He came, and John 1:11 says he came to his own people, Israel. And they did not receive him. Boy, now there is a massive understatement. Not only did they reject him, they nailed him to this cross. They killed him. He came, I'm your Christ or Messiah, prophet, priest, and king. They didn't want a Messiah or Christ like him. So they killed him. In the remarkable plan of a God who is in control of things, God used their rejection to accomplish the essential element of our salvation that sets things right. It is just a remarkable outworking of the wisdom of God in all of this. So we have, if I can go back here, he came to his own people, that is Israel. But they didn't receive him, they killed him. And yet I want you to notice this as well. But to all who did receive him. So it's not that every single one in Israel rejected him. There were some who turned to him and responded in faith. And I know they responded in faith because here we have receive him is explained as believe in his name. Okay? So what God requires is that you believe in his name. Now, I've written that there to make this point. A lot of people talk about believing in Jesus. And most people who talk about believing in Jesus mean that they acknowledge that he truly came. They acknowledge some of the historical details about him, even some of the theological details about him. Yeah, I believe Jesus came. I believe Jesus died. I believe Jesus is the Son of God. I believe he rose from the dead. All of those things. That is just intellectual assent to facts. But in the Bible, when it talks about belief or faith, especially when it's worded this way, in his name, it doesn't mean just intellectually assenting to the historical facts. Something else is going on here. It is an unreserved trust manifest in commitment to him, with a loyal love that embraces him. We will have occasion to talk more about what it means to believe in his name a little later on in John's gospel, especially in chapter 3. In fact, in chapter 3, I'll tell you a little bit about an archaeological discovery that makes it very clear that believe in his name does not mean just acknowledge the facts. Okay? I point this out because I think there are an awful lot of people who think everything's okay between God and me because I acknowledge who Jesus is. Well, that's not what you're called to do at all. So, those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God. And then he describes this in terminology that Jesus will unpack, again, in chapter 3. He talks about the fact that they were born. There's a spiritual birth that takes place. Okay? When we get to chapter 3, Jesus will say, you must be what? Anybody know? Born again. Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, we'll unpack the details of that, but for now you need to know this is talking about a spiritual birth, who are born, and then look what John does here. He says, born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man. So what do you have here? You have, it has nothing to do with your heritage. Nothing to do with your heritage. Pardon me, my scribbling's bad enough, but occasionally when I'm scribbling, there are buttons on this pen that I push. Anyway, so heritage, if you can't read that. So it has nothing to do with your heritage, and he stresses that because there were certain Jewish people who thought that because they descended from Abraham, everything was okay with them. You say, well, that's a foolish thing to think. It is. And I run into people all the time who think that they're okay because of their family heritage in this church or that church. It's not about that. It's about a personal relationship with Christ. So it's not about your heritage. And it's not about what you do or what you choose to do. It's not about the will of the flesh, a human choice. So I got this covered. I'll be okay with God because I'm going to choose to do the kinds of things that will be pleasing to God. Not possible. And thirdly, what others do. It says, nor the will of man. So maybe there are others who do things that you count on to affect your salvation. And I'm going to say something that's controversial, but you just hold on through the study, and I think you will come to this conclusion. There are people who count on the fact that someone sprinkled water on them, especially as infants, that makes them right with God. At a point when they couldn't even know what's going on, couldn't express faith. See? the will of man. Somebody decided that they would make a Christian of you. Okay. Scriptures say that none of this counts. Not what you do, not what somebody else does for you, not your heritage. None of this brings you to God. But God has to do something. So this is the fourth in this list. God must save. Now, lest you think that I'm just kind of getting picky here, and what I'm saying you can take or leave, let me take you to one cross-reference here that I mentioned last week that we would deal with. For those of you who don't know what I mean, the Bible is a book made up of 66 smaller books, and those are even divided into two parts. Big part is called Old Testament, smaller part, New Testament. Don't worry about the titles, but the dividing line is the first coming of Christ that separates those two parts of the Bible. So you have these various books, and sometimes when there's a topic that you're thinking about, you can go to other books in the Bible to see what those authors had to say about the same topic. And that will enlighten your understanding. And so we call those cross-references. So I'm going to take you to a cross-reference now that will help us understand what's going on here in John chapter 1. So here. This, by the way, if you want to put this in your margin, this is, pardon me, there we go. This is failed in my setup today, I see. Okay, so there. This is Ephesians and we're going to look at chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. In chapter 2, the Apostle Paul has been explaining humanity's condition as spiritually dead. He starts that in verse 1. And he describes that as the condition of all human beings, but that, for some, a change takes place. And he attributes that change to God doing a work of grace in our lives because he loves us and he's merciful to us. Well, you come to verse 8 and you have an explanation of this. Notice how it starts with the word for. This means I'm going to explain this to you. He says, by grace you have been saved. Saved simply means delivered. Delivered from the awful consequence of our rebellion is what he's talking about here. By grace you have been saved. So earlier in the chapter, here's what you once were, but now that is changed, and it's because of God's grace. It's because of God's grace. So I need you to understand something has changed from last week. It does not like me laying my hand on here. All right, so he says you have been saved by grace, and by grace we mean the favor or kindness of God. Yeah, that really is kindness. The favor or kindness of God, but it means more than that. It means favor or kindness that is unearned, undeserved. God is kind to us, not in response to something we've done that prompts him to be kind. God is kind to us, not because there's something within us that moves him to be kind. It's unearned, undeserved. He tells us here that this is given to us through faith. We receive it by faith, though we don't do anything to earn it or deserve it. It's just we hold out an empty hand and he gives it. Notice he says, and this is not your own doing. So what we have here is faith alone. Not something you do. In fact, if you try to earn it, it ceases to be grace. So you are still apart from God. He does not save those who try to earn it. It is by grace, received through faith alone, and so he says it is not of you or from you. Look, not your own doing. Nothing you can do will cause God to do this for you. Notice he also says it is not a result of works. No works. So not of works. Doesn't originate with you, and it certainly doesn't originate in your works. So then what is it? Well, in keeping with grace, kindness, it says it is the gift of God. It's a gift. Now, we all understand something about what a gift is. I've said this so many times through the years, it's kind of old hat around here. If I gave you, I don't have, most precious thing I have, if I gave you my Bible and you received it and said, thank you. And I said, and in order for you to have this gift from me, I would like for you to wash my car. Is the Bible then a gift? No. You're earning it. You're doing something I've told you to do so that you earn the gift. Shouldn't use my Bible in a story like that. But anyway, you see the point. It's not something that you do because you can't do anything, because we are in rebellion against God. It is not something that is accomplished through works, because works destroy grace. If you think I'm okay with God because I'm a good guy, compared to your neighbors, you might be a fantastic guy. But you know what you're doing? You are depending on your own works as a nice guy to be received by God. that undermines everything. And it is just misplaced confidence, because none of us have anything that we can bring to God that is the perfect gift that would cause him to be kind to us. His kindness originates within himself, and he lavishes it on unworthy people like me and like you. All right. Let me take you back over to John. Let's see if I can get this to cooperate here. So, these are born not of blood or the will of the flesh or the will of man, but of God. We come to this remarkable verse 14. The Word, speaking of Christ, became flesh. I want to teach you a theological word. It's an important one that describes what's going on in this verse. It is the word put this on a staff meeting note that we got to figure out why this is happening, and it didn't happen the first 3 weeks we met. All right, so here we go. The word is incarnation. The incarnation. There's a root here. Comes from a Latin word. We find this word this root in other words in our English language. For example, it's in the word carnivore. So what do you think the root means? What is a carnivore? A meat eater. This is the word, comes from a Latin root that means flesh. In theology, we talk about Christ coming, eternal Son of God, eternal Spirit, but he took to himself humanity. He became a man, and it's described here as becoming flesh. That's our essence. We are the flesh, and he became one of us. It's a remarkable part of the story of Jesus. Eternal Son of God stepped into human history, took to himself a human nature without ceasing to be God. He became one of us so that he can resolve the problem of the fall. Okay? Now, he was incarnated. He became one of us. But notice John emphasizes this. Dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. We read through this in the English language. You remember that the Bible it didn't originate in English. So this was written in another language. This part written in the Greek language. And those Greek readers would have seen something here that we overlook. When it talks about the fact that he dwelt among us, it has the idea of this. He pitched his tent. He pitched his tent in our midst. That is so strange, unless you know your Bible. This is a connection with something that went on in the first part of the Bible, literally 1,500 years before Christ came. Some of you, I know, are familiar with the story of God taking Israel out of Egypt. You remember the miracles that were performed as Moses led the nation of Israel out of slavery in Egypt. When they departed, they ended up making a long trek to the land that God gave them. And God gave them a place of worship that was portable. They could take it with them. I'm gonna put an artist's rendering up here while I describe this. The place of worship was called the tabernacle, which means the tent. And God demonstrated his presence there. Do you see this? Can you see the tent portrayed here? They would set it up in the middle of the camp, and God gave very specific instructions about how the Israelites were to camp. There were 12 tribes. So he would have 3 tribes camp in specified places on each of the 4 sides. So that's all 12. So you can see depicted here all of these rows of tents that they lived in as they traveled along. And God demonstrated his presence with them. At night, there was a pillar of fire that rested on this tent. During the day, it was a pillar of smoke. And the scriptures say that when time came for them to move to a new location, the pillar would move. They would dismantle the camp. They would go to the place where the pillar led them, and then they would set up camp again, and the pillar would rest on the tent once again. You know what we call this pillar of fire and a cloud? It is called the Shekinah glory. Shekinah means the presence. So the presence of God was evident there. It was his glorious presence. And it rested on the tent that symbolized God's presence among his people. So, with that thought in mind, let me take you back to this passage. The Word became flesh and pitched his tent in our midst. It's a reference to God being present among his people. It's a reference to this one being central in the life of his people, as the tent was, where they all surrounded when they camped. Is a reference to something else as well. The tent was the place where sacrifice was made for the atonement of sin. And John is saying Jesus is the place where sin is atoned for. By the way, we confirm this when we have seen his glory. The tent is pitched. The glory is there, the glory of God. It is a remarkable mental image that John paints for us, emphasizing the identity of Christ. God himself is here in our midst, John was saying. And we have seen that glory. Now, I want you to notice right here we have a parenthesis and right here a parenthesis. If we eliminated verse 15, then 14 and 16 would flow very smoothly. But what John does here with this parenthesis is he wants to pause and make it very clear that he's not making this up. So he offers the testimony of one of the prophets. We've already been introduced to him in the prologue. He calls him John, but it's not John the Apostle who wrote the book. This is John the Baptist. So John the Baptist gave testimony of these things. And he singles out something that John the Baptist said that is simply remarkable. He says, he who comes after me ranks before me. He's more important than I am. For, he says, because he was before me. So you have here two people being discussed. You have John, I'll just put B, John the Baptist, and you have Jesus. And John the Baptist says, he was before me. Of these two people, John the Baptist and Jesus, do you know which one was born first? It's John the Baptist. So how can John the Baptist say Jesus was before me? He's already said he's more important than me, but he bases that on the fact that Jesus was before him. Well, if Jesus was born in Bethlehem after John the Baptist was born, what's he talking about here? Well, he's talking about what we learned all the way back up in verse 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. This one predates John the Baptist because he is the eternal God. So we pick it up with verse 16. From his fullness, that is Christ's fullness, we have all received grace upon grace. Now, I would really like to talk to you a lot about this grace upon grace, and I'm just going to summarize it so that we can wrap up this paragraph. Grace upon grace